For us at St. Basil's, founded by the Basilians, the connection we have with Dr. Higgins is that he is currently the Basilian Distinguished Fellow of Contemporary Catholic Thought at the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto, in addition to being an academic. But don't worry, his talk is not going to be a lecture, and he is known to inject humor into his presentations. Michael Higgins is a brilliant writer, a journalist, a public speaker.
Karen went to university with him.
A color commentator, a husband, a father, and the author of the weekly Pontifex Minimus blog. He attended the Synod in Rome and is currently writing a book about that experience. His most recently published book, The Jesuit Disruptor, in which our pastor, Father Darrell, gets quoted, interprets Francis as a positive disruptor. Francis is a Jesuit, and Higgins suggests that to understand Francis and his papacy, we need to recognize and understand how Jesuits think and are formed. You might want to read another Higgins book, The Jesuit Mystique. The notions of discernment and listening are key in Jesuit spirituality, and thus to both the papacy of Francis and to his convening of the Synod. We are indeed blessed to have Michael Higgins with us as he invites us to consider our esteemed Holy Father from yet another prism. Welcome, Dr. Higgins.
Thank you, Heather. So I can begin now, right?
Yes.
Okay, here we go.
From Karen. Well, hi, Karen.
All righty. Well, I guess some are still, I don't know if you want to mute. Probably everyone should mute at the moment except me, because otherwise the conversations get in the way of the talk, right? All right.
Oh, you're kidding.
So can we ask everyone, please?
You have to mute. You have to. The question and answer, no, but that's different. You can unmute, but during the presentation, if people are talking, it's a distraction for the others. Okay, so if you could mute, that would be wonderful. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here, even if virtually, rather than physically. St. Basil has a long and wonderful history, of course, and you're a progressive parish, and you're engaged with the life of the church and the life of a changing church in some important ways. Not foundationally, but in very, very important ways. And that's what I want to talk about. And I want to open it by situating it within a certain context. I was just talking to Kevin Burns about this, but I was in Florida last week, giving an address at a conference on addiction and rehabilitation in Orlando. Now, I actually know nothing about either of those subject matters, but they wanted me to talk about Henry Nouwen's notion of the wounded healer. And that's a topic on which I have written and Kevin has written, so I'm familiar with it, so I was happy to accept the invitation. It was very instructive to spend 2 or 3 days with people in various degrees of recovery and therapy and leadership and reflection. It was quite beautiful in its way, certainly illuminating for me. But here's my point. After that, I was to go down to see some friends, long-standing friends, who spend 4 months of the year in Florida. And I went off, and I was supposed to be there for 3 days. Well, I was there for a week because there were enormous difficulties getting a flight out of where I was to the mainland, and so it became quite a trial. I'm sure for them too. They were thinking 3 days, and I had a week of Higgins. That can be exhausting even to think about. But anyway. One of the things I discovered when I was there, and this is what I want to mention really, that's important, the rest is relatively irrelevant, just sets the context. While I was there, I went to Mass at the Basilica, and I had gone before when my wife and I had been previously there, and the rector of the Basilica at that time was a prayerful, warm, open priest. It was very clear to us that people loved him. He was informal in his approach. He was pastoral in everything that he did. Well, this time, several years later, coming back, he's suffering from dementia. And as a consequence, he's no longer the rector. So they've appointed a different rector. And this rector is your classic ecclesiastical careerist. He came from a position in the archdiocese of some importance and was sent down. And his style is entirely different. Highly theatrical, deeply clerical, not in the good sense of that term. And what struck me was the peculiarity of his approach in his homily. He wanted to focus particularly on raising money. So he said, you know, Jesus is in your bank book. Jesus is in your checkbook. He's in your account. And I thought, well, this is an unusual approach to begging, and then proceeded to talk about gifts that you can buy in the gift shop, the fact that the confessional is now open if people want to avail themselves. This is right during Mass. So every kind of major liturgical innovation or development or reform that came from the council seemed to be violated. And I thought afterwards, what an interesting contrast in ecclesiologies. You had this older priest who was deeply pastoral and this younger priest who has replaced him, who seemed more concerned about getting his mozzetta, which is a kind of a black covering that rectors sometimes wear in anticipation of being a Monsignor, then get the red piping and all this kind of thing. Pope Francis postponed the appointment or the creation of Monsignors to after the age of 65. So sometimes ambitious clerics start wearing some of the garments before that time. In and of itself, it's relatively harmless, just a simple indulgence. But it's more than that. It's a symbol. Where do you stand in relation to the people that you preside over in terms of the Eucharist, people that you shepherd? If you could identify the shepherd as one of you, in other words, is not enveloped in some kind of quasi-medieval finery, but is in fact available to you, then it seems to me you're dealing with a Francis priest. The newer chap seems to me to be rather set in a different age. That in and of itself is problematic, and perhaps during the Q&A we can talk about it. But these contrasting ecclesiologies struck me because they underscore the current struggle within the Church to appropriate the wisdom and the style of Pope Francis. Now, Heather kindly mentioned that the most recent book that I've done is called The Jesuit Disruptor, a personal portrait of Pope Francis. And some people have objected to the use of the term disruptor. They think it's offensive or unnecessarily provocative. And that's partly understandable because, of course, they're thinking of Donald Trump as a disruptor. And they think, well, disruptors are people who create problems, yes. But that's disruptor spelt with an ER. Disruptor spelt with an OR is a much more benign and positive use of the term. It means someone that unsettles our established ways of doing things in order for us to see through a new lens. And that's what Mario Bergoglio, Pope Francis, priest of the Society of Jesus, that's what he's doing. Not what he's just done, but what he continues to do. Heather had mentioned that I was in Rome for the Synod. I was. That book actually is coming out this year. It's called The 60 Days That Shook the Church. And it's a diary on the Synod on Synodality. And it's the culmination, really, of many years of consultation and preparation. But more than that, it is the apex of the concept of synodality, this special synod, but also of Francis's thinking on synodality. What does it mean to be a synodal church? How is that different from the way we are church now? Is it a radical upheaval? Is it a departure from everything that we know? Is it a shattering of the organic idea that we have of the church? Or is it a way of allowing us to break out of the fetters and the shackles of a false traditionalism and to begin to see the gospel and the ministry of the church in a new and refreshing way? And it seems to me that it is the latter that Francis is about. That creates problems, I'm sure, as you can anticipate and appreciate, because it disrupts things. It forces us to think differently. We don't like doing that. We don't like doing it in our private lives. We don't like doing it in our financial lives. We certainly don't like doing it in our political and social lives. So we shouldn't be surprised that there is ecclesiastical or church resistance to this change. It's understandable, largely because we like settled things. We like established patterns. Look how upset we are by the shattering of every conceivable convention, indeed every conceivable human standard, that the current Republican president of the United States indulges in. He shatters everything. Well, for some people, they love the new chaos because it's the recreation of their society as they best understand it and the destruction of a world they deplore. That's not what Francis is doing. This is a matter of reform in continuity. It's a matter of saying, okay, this is the church that we've known, that we love, that has all its pathologies. Let's not fool ourselves. The church is riddled with problems, but at the same time, it is also the mystical body of Christ. It's a combining of this exciting creative tension that is important in the thinking of Pope Francis. And so what he does, he doesn't want to eradicate the past. He wants in some ways to reform it, to reconnect with a healthy traditionalism, to reconnect with the church that is alive, not moribund, that is not a museum piece, but a living organism, most especially, of course, using his wonderful pastoral image, a field hospital, not the perfect society, the societas perfectae that we sometimes talk about in terms of the life of the church, but in terms of a shattered, wounded church, receiving others, including others in the act of ecclesial healing, in the act of spiritual healing. So let me just quote a couple of things from the Jesuit Disruptor, the book itself, which I think says about as the best way that I can think of what something of this change means and what it's going to mean to us, okay? So it's a new way in thinking about the church, and in a way, it's a new way of doing theology. Now, most of us are not professional theologians, right? There's no reason, but one has to be a theologian in order to be a practicing Christian. But theological reflection is a way of allowing the church to think deeply about the matters to which it is attached and to which it is called to articulate. So we need theologians. We need people to do, if you like, the heavy lifting theologically. But if they do it in abstraction, if they do it disengaged from the larger human reality, then the theology is empty. And theologians are speaking only to themselves. So it is important that theology be a living power within the life of the church. Just before my book came out, actually, he came out with a document called Ad Theologiam Provamendum, meaning promoting theology. Now, this document actually was a formal or official statement that was coming from one of the theological bodies that report to the Pope, but it is illustrative of the change. So I just want to read a little bit to you here to show you what's happening. This document was issued in part as the Pope's approval of the new statutes drawn up by the Vatican's Pontifical Academy of Theology. Although it reflects current theological thinking in that it incorporates much of the methodological approach of the social sciences, and although it further develops Francis's perspective that theology must not remain secure in its intellectual citadel, but be open to the world at the grassroots level. Francis categorically states that to promote theology in the future, we cannot limit ourselves to abstractly reproposing formulas and schemes from the past. And here's the kicker. For God has revealed himself, God has revealed God's self as history, not as a compendium of abstract truths. End of quote. Now, the document being a crystallization of much of his thinking around the role of theology, Francis is not shy in declaring that the science of theology is called to a turning point, to a paradigm shift, to a courageous cultural revolution. And when he means theology here, he just doesn't mean academic theology. He means us as the church, the people who attend Mass and are part of the life of St. Basil's. It's not just for the academy. Called, in fact, to become a fundamentally contextual theology, by which Francis means that it's a theology that must be, and I quote, capable of reading and interpreting the gospel in the conditions in which women and men live daily, in different geographical, social, and cultural environments. Theology cannot take place in a culture of dialogue and encounter between traditions and knowledge if it's not respected in itself. Between religions, openly confronting all believers and non-believers. Let me just stop here for a moment. When I was at the synod And I was not there as a delegate. I was there as an analyst, as a journalist for Paul's Press in New York. So while I was there, I lived with the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, and you would be familiar with that order, of course, in Ottawa. And that third general to the Via Aurelia, that's where I stayed. And then every day I would go down to La Stampa della Santa Sede, which is the press office of the Holy See. So this is my daily route, did this every day for several hours of work. And one of the things I discovered in living with, I don't know, maybe about 60 oblates from around the world, many of them quite young, was one day I was sitting with one of the delegates from Namibia, a priest, in fact, a bishop, an archbishop. And one day we were chatting about something, and he said, I've just come from a visit with Pope Francis. And the African bishops, for us, the issue around women in the presbyterate, women in the diaconate, LGBTQ issues, they're all important, but they're not the primary priority. The real pastoral priority, the challenge in African countries is polygamy. What do we do about polygamy? How do we handle this from a pastoral point of view? And so we spoke with Francis, and rather than saying, well, impose the law, insist on the sanctions, make sure that people who have more than one wife are not allowed access to communion, all this kind of thing, take the strictly legal approach. No, he said to them, I understand, accompany them, instruct, witness, keep me informed. Okay, now that's not only prudential, not only diplomatic, it is theologically, of course, accurate. And I at one point I said to the Archbishop, I said, is polygamy widespread in all of Africa, or is it unique to some jurisdictions? He said, no, it's throughout all of Africa. So I said, well, what about polyandry, having several husbands? Is that an issue? He said, only in one country, but he wouldn't tell me what the country was. But it was a perfect illustration in my mind of the fact that Francis's approach is to listen to the people on the ground. The African bishops come and they speak to him and they ask his advice. And he doesn't say to them, here's what you need to do. He says to them, accompany the people. I hear you. Write a document on this experience and send it to me. Deal with this at the pastoral level. Okay? And that, I think, is entirely reflective of his open approach as Peter. Let me say, traditionalist theologians, however, may find this new theology a sad consolidation of the Pope's woolly thinking. In fact, criticism was best exemplified by the commentary of a Capuchin friar in the United States by the name of Thomas Weinandy, who sees it, and I quote, this is a typical Pope Francis document. A great deal of high-sounding words that are very ambiguous. It is mostly bells and whistles. There can be no authentic paradigm shift without being faithful to upholding and promoting what the Church has authentically taught through the centuries, end of quote. But the disruptor Jesuit Pope has done precisely that. He's inaugurated a paradigm shift by being faithful to the organic tradition, not jettisoning it, not watering it down, but through a deeper fidelity. He has disrupted, this is why he's the disruptor. He has disrupted the established pattern of doing things as the premier occupant of the Vatican. He has disrupted the protocols that are the mainstay of institutional life on the Tiber. He has disrupted the way we see the church working in the world. He has disrupted the pattern of church priorities by centering the believing community on and with the poor. And he has disrupted the settled questions by introducing a new perspective, replacing a magisterial with a synodal way of being church. And he has managed to hold to the tradition he has sworn to protect as Peter by refusing to alter church teaching either by papal fiat or parliamentary consensus, by refusing to disregard forms of devotion or what sociologists now call popular religiosity, and by refusing to dismiss the work of his predecessors, and instead building on their scaffolding. Pope Francis, then, is the disruptor par excellence. not because he wants to disturb, but because he wants us to become reacquainted with the authentic charisms of the church, our call to ministry and witness. Not that Catholics in the past have been inadequate to the task. He's not saying that. This is not a judgment. It's not an historical judgment. It's a realization on his part as a pastor. And remember, he was a parish priest, a Jesuit, a rector of a seminary. He was an auxiliary bishop. He was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. He was a cardinal. He's been involved in pastoral work for a good deal of his life. So this is not some later kind of decorative add-on to his ministry. It's constitutive of his ministry as a pastor. Except now, you know, instead of being on the Plata, he's on the Tiber. He's presiding as the universal pastor. But he brings to that all the gifts and the challenges and the flaws and the weaknesses. Francis is not perfect. He's riddled with imperfection, like all of us. Okay, I think it's very important in talking about Francis not to fall into the trap of becoming an apologist, saying everything that Francis says is right, his critics are always wrong, every judgment or decision he makes is the perfect one. Of course not. How could that ever be? Popes are as human as the rest of us, and he is driven also by consultation with his friends, his allies, his members of the Curia that are close to him. So, I mean, we have to recognize the fundamental humanity of Francis at the same time as we celebrate his special gifts that he has brought to the church at this relatively turbulent time in world history, not uniquely within the Catholic orbit, but within the larger world. I was at a dinner party just the other night in which my wife and I were there, and it in part was to celebrate the publication of the book, and it was by invitation from a very prominent member of the Globe and Mail who was for many years the head of the Middle East Bureau. And he and his wife hosted this, and pretty well everybody who was at the dinner was either Catholic or Jewish. In fact, the Catholics were the minority. Interest in Francis, interest in his ministry among the Jewish members who were at the table was intense. They're drawn to him like they were drawn to Roncalli, and in many ways to Caro Votiva, John Paul II. But Francis even more so. And I thought, and I've seen it again and again, people outside the Catholic orbit that are drawn to the leadership style of Pope Francis because he's, in a way, an antidote. He's an antidote to the larger poison that seems to infect political leadership around the world. The Vatican will always remain a relatively soft power, but a power of great influence. Just last week, I got a phone call from somebody in England working for a digital publication, which I'm ashamed to say I was unfamiliar with, called The Monocle. And the person who contacted me wanted to talk about Francis's influence, very clearly demonstrated, in getting Cuban prisoners released. What was the influence of Francis in working with Havana? Where did it come from? Why has it been important? Why was it that he worked closely with Obama to lift American sanctions against Cuba? They have been restored since with President Trump. But the rapprochement, if you like, between the United States, or attempted rapprochement between the United States and Cuba, was in great measure the result of the work of the Secretary of State, Cardinal Parolin, but also earlier Cardinal Jaime Ortega, who is he's now deceased, Archbishop Cardinal of Havana. In other words, the Pope does continue to exercise soft power and influence at a moral level and at a spiritual level that the world is desperate for. So Francis has done something significant in restoring, if you like, the credibility and the value of the papal office for the larger world, at the same time as he wrestles with division and fractiousness and resistance from Catholics within its jurisdiction. So it's one of those ironies that occasionally afflict church history, but is dramatically illustrated, I think, by the current situation at every level. At the end of the synod, a document was released called the Final Report. And I just want to conclude these preliminary comments, and because I know the question and answer is an important part of this format that you have, and quite rightly so. You don't want a mini lecture. So I'm just giving you some material, some reflections at my end, and then we'll open up for the larger discussion. But I just want to conclude with this thing about inverting the pyramid, which constitutes that paradigm shift. You know, for most Roman Catholics, and Francis talks about this, for most Roman Catholics, we tend to think of the church in terms of a pyramid, and the laity are at the bottom of the pyramid. And then you go up, and at the very top, at the apex, of course, is the Pope himself. Francis prefers the inverted pyramid. The pyramid's on its head. And so Francis, the Pope, then takes on the significance of one of his titles. Popes have a number of titles: Vicar of Christ, Head of the Vatican City State, Patriarch of the West, although a Patriarch of the West actually was rescinded by Pope Benedict XVI as a concession to Orthodox patriarchs in terms of ecumenical dialogue. But they have several other titles. But one of the most important titles, and rarely used, but I think really speaks to the heart of the Petrine ministry, is the Pope is the servant of the servants of God. Service servorum Dei, the servant of the servants of God. And so when you invert the pyramid, the Pope's at the bottom. He's the primary servant. He's the servant of the servants. And now in that world, you're going to have a different way of relating to each other, right? You're going to be more respectful. You're going to be less polarizing. You're going to be open to suasion. You're going to be less inclined to be apodictic or absolutist or self-righteous in your approach to things. In other words, you're going to operate in a milieu of some humility, because in the process of teaching, you're also in the process of learning. The ecclesia docens is also the ecclesia dicens, as Cardinal Newman would say in talking about the sense of the faithful. So Francis is reshaping the church, but not in a way his critics accuse him of. There's no sundering of Catholic doctrine. There's no additions to the creed, nor any deletions from the creed. Everything that is de fide remains de fide. What he's struggling to do, and to a great degree is succeeding in many quarters at least, is changing the culture, the ecclesial culture. How do we talk to each other? How do we think and pray with each other? How do we move forward with humility, trying to understand new challenges and theories that affect the way we understand ourselves as baptized Christians? That's no small task. That's a huge task. And Francis has started that going with the notion of synodality. So the success of the Synod on Synodality, which concluded in October of last year, lies not only in its summary document called the Final Report, and in Francis's decision to endorse it as part of his magisterium rather than issue a post-synodal exhortation. This is really important, folks. After synods conclude, and I've been covering synods for years under John Paul II, Benedict, and Francis. Not all of them, but several of them. And one of the things that is a feature or part of the architecture of the synod is a concluding document. Sometimes they're called propositions, sometimes a summary document, sometimes a final report, sometimes a synthesis report, or whatever. And it goes to the Pope. And then the Pope reads it and he thinks about it, and then he comes out with a document. And it could be months later. He comes out with a document which basically is his view of the material that has been brought forward by the Synod Fathers, but now the Synod Fathers and Mothers and lay people and everything else, because it's a different constitution. And what does he do? He does something that's never happened before. He receives the final report and says to the Synod delegates, this is the teaching of the magisterium. I don't need to add anything to it. Okay? Now, that may seem in itself a minor matter. It's not. It's a dramatic departure from the way things were done. Partly because it says, look, I'm Pope Francis. This is my job. I've been with you for the last 2 months. 1 month in October of 24, one in 23. And I've been with you. I've been at the table as often as I can. I've listened to you. I've participated in conversation. I trust you. The work of the Spirit is in the Synod. I don't need to add anything to it. This is extraordinary because in it lies the heart of Francis's pastoral strategy, which is giving us the spiritual taste of what it actually means to be the people of God. Okay, so rather than read some more chapters to you from this delightfully enticing book, I thought I probably should now begin to respond to questions in the chat room. Or now, Kevin, will you mediate this, or am I?
Yes, I'll be mediating. So the questions are coming in, and I'm before we go to those questions, I have the opportunity to have actually one of my own. While I was waiting for the session to begin, I did something quite rare. I tuned in to the Angelus presentation from the Vatican today, it being a Sunday.
Yep, Sunday.
And there's a wonderful mirror image to what you're talking about, Michael, in his reflection. So the context of the gospel reading is the people around Jesus who didn't kind of latch on to the message.
Yes.
And Pope Francis says that perhaps they, talking of those in the scripture, think they already know him. But then Francis did something wonderful. He flipped the pronoun. He said that we already hear everything about him, that we have grown up with him in school, in the parish, in catechism, in a country with a Catholic culture. And so for us too, he is a person who is close, indeed, perhaps even too close. I think that's a very provocative image of the papacy in as well. What are your reflections on that, please?
Well, I think it demonstrates Francis's strong commitment to humility. When he talks to the synod delegates, and when he talks to the bishops, and when he talks to the College of Cardinals, he's always reminding them of the importance that humility is the conduit or the pathway to truly understanding or apprehending truth. That very often we take strong absolutist positions. We think we know the truth, just like we think we possess Jesus. And from that point of view, we don't actually listen to the other. We don't reverence the other because we think we know what Jesus intends to be the case. We think we know what Jesus means. We think we know who Jesus is. As a consequence, there's a foreclosure in terms of that deeper experience and spiritual openness that Francis thinks is an important part of widening the Catholic vision. So that's the kind of thing you would say. And it's the kind of thing that would disturb people, right? Because if they actually listen to it, he's upending things as he always does. So Catholic culture in Italy, the role of the Vatican, that's where Catholic truth resides. That's where we can be assured that we're in possession of the truth. And he's saying, well, not quite. Sometimes our proximity to these things actually gets in the way of our deeper understanding. And so it's always calling back to humility. It's one of the constant themes right from the beginning of his pontificate. And one of the reasons why I think why he took the name Francis. It wasn't just because Francis of Assisi was a model of evangelical poverty. It's because of his fundamental humility. So I think that would be my response, Kevin.
Thank you. There's a wonderful trick question that I want to start with here, because it assumes you've read the book, and I don't know, and not your book. Is there anything in Pope Francis's recent autobiography that really surprised you?
I haven't read it, and I probably won't. I have a strong objection to the way papal biographies or autobiographies, I should say, are written. It began under John Paul II, and we saw it very importantly with Benedict XVI, that you have particularly identified and often supplicant journalists who work with the pontiff to craft response, the often cryptic summary and whatever. And they're the primary intermediaries. They're the ones that craft, edit, and put this together. So they're not spiritual ghostwriters because we know who they are. We have their names on the book, but I've always found them scripted, We know the basic narrative points of Francis's life, and we know he loves to talk, and we know he's never comfortable with any kind of a script. We know all this. I'm not sure that there would be much more that would be disclosed. I think Austin Ivory and other biographers. I'm not a biographer, by the way. The Jesuit Disruptor is a portrait of a pontificate. Some people have called it a biography. It is not actually. So I think the biographical, the heavy lifting has been done. So I think this is I think this is a money generator. Having said that, it's also on the bestseller list. So this is kind of wonderful. People want to know, again, something about Pope Francis. So if it accomplishes some good from that end, all to the better. But it's not a book I'm likely to read.
So, Michael, you used the expression heavy lifting there, and you used it earlier on about the contemplative heavy lifting is what you said. So the question hinges on that. You say heavy contemplative lifting. When you say that, it makes me think of heavy contemplative lifting. Can you say something about that will help me maybe explain heavy contemplative lifting to those who are active in all my circles?
But I think what I mean by it is that often we see contemplation as an antinomy, as the opposite to activity. And when you look at people like Thomas Merton, of course, an important figure actually in the spirituality of Pope Francis, you see someone who wrestled with these contradictions, but recognized that the heavy lifting of the contemplative was in great measure a deepening of the interior life, but also in an important way a deepening of the ecclesial life. Because if the contemplative is engaged only in a largely solipsistic activity, improving myself, rather than looking at it in terms of the communal dimension of spirituality, hence the ecclesia or the assembly, then you make the serious mistake of turning spirituality into an individualistic commodity. And contemplation then becomes any number of variations, if you like, or one of the variations of what we have in terms of mindfulness and meditation and all these other kinds of things, which have undoubted value, no doubt, clearly, but don't essentially constitute contemplation in the way we understand it within the Catholic tradition. So the heavy lifting is a matter of, maybe the better phrasing would be that the integration of contemplation in the life of meaningful and authentic active witness. Francis is keen on this, actually, and it may be part of his Jesuit training and his Jesuit spirituality, that spirituality and contemplation is an active mode. It's not just a retiring mode, right? So silence feeds you, solitude strengthens you, not because it allows you to remain isolated from the larger community, but because it helps you to restore the contemplative dimension to the larger community and actually to enrich that larger community. So it's a lived dialogue.
Thank you, Michael. Can I wind you back to Thomas Merton? Thomas Merton figures prominently in your book, and maybe it would be valuable if you reflected a little on what kind of link you see in the example and the writing of Thomas Merton and Pope Francis. Could you say more about that, please?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Many of you may recall that John Boehner, I think it was John Boehner, who was he's a Roman Catholic, was the Speaker of the Senate in the United States. And he, along with President Obama, working with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, asked Pope Francis to come to address the joint houses of Congress, which he did. When Francis did that, he identified 4 specific moral prophets in American life. So he talked about Abraham Lincoln, he talked about Martin Luther King, and he talked about 2 Catholics. One was Dorothy Day, and the other was Thomas Merton. Now, we all know how this is done. The office in Washington would have great measure crafted this. There would have been conversations between the Vatican and Washington about what's going to be said. But we also know that Francis only says what he believes. If he wants to change something or depart from the text or add to the text, he will. So everything he says, he's appropriated and made his own. So when he talks about Merton, it's interesting when he talks about contemplation. This is important to him. We come back to that word again, right? And openness in dialogue to the interreligious reality of the world. Francis understands that Catholicism, Christianity, exists within a larger multi-faith universal reality. One of the reasons why he's met with imams and leaders of the different sections of Islam, one of the reasons why he's very close to many rabbis from Jerusalem, from Rome, and from elsewhere. One of the reasons why he has befriended many of the Orthodox patriarchs, including but principally Patriarch Bartholomew of Istanbul. So he's gone out of his way to be deeply ecumenical as well as deeply interfaith. I want to quote this because I think, in response to Kevin, this is probably the best way for me to say why I think Merton continues to be an abiding presence in his life. Thomas Merton was a prophet, as defined by the Pope. In his life as Pope, Bergoglio has come by a different route to share the same comprehensive embrace of a culture of dialogue that was articulated by Merton, this famous American Trappist monk, in his diary called Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. Here's what Merton says: the more that I am able to affirm others, to say yes to them in myself, by discovering them in myself and myself in them, the more real I am. Now, I am fully real if my own heart says yes to everyone. I will be a better Catholic, not if I can refute every shade of Protestantism, but if I can affirm the truth in it and still go further. So too with the Muslims, the Hindus, the Buddhists. This does not mean syncretism or indifferentism, the vapid and careless friendliness that accepts everything by thinking nothing. No, no, no. If I affirm myself by denying all that is Muslim, all that is Jewish, all that is Protestant, Hindu, and Buddhist, in the end, I will find that there is not much left for me to affirm as a Catholic, and certainly no breath of the Spirit with which to affirm it. End of quote. In his struggle to contain all these divided worlds, Merton realized that he needed to evolve even further beyond healing the rifts in Christianity, and to affirm and not refute the truth in Judaism, in Islam, in Hinduism, and Buddhism, etc. And this is precisely what Pope Francis has done in his papacy, the fruit of his culture of genuine encounter and dialogue. You see, the Jesuit Disruptor, the Pontifex Maximus, the big bridge builder, is a bridge to a greater and encompassing unity. And I think that, Kevin, is what he drew from Merton. We do know, and this is important, that Merton was very well read in Spanish-speaking countries. Very well read, pretty well in many countries of the world, hugely popular, translated into, dozens and dozens of languages. But he was particularly drawn to Latin America, Thomas Merton. At one point, he wanted to go to Solantanami in Nicaragua and live with his former disciple, Father Cardinal. He did something that hadn't been done, and often goes unrecognized, actually, from a literary point of view. He was a major translator of Central and Latin American poets into the English language before it became common. So it was the late 50s, early 60s. He was doing translations of poets from Honduras and from Mexico and from Guatemala, Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil. So he was translating from both the Spanish and the Portuguese. And so the value he attached to Latin American literature and Latin American spirituality was way ahead of him, of others. And my sense is that Francis would have known that. I have no evidence of that. The only evidence I have is, that he went to Washington to talk about Merton. He's talked about Merton in other cases. We know that he was fond of Merton, but so was Benedict. So was John Paul II. Merton was a darling of many of the popes. So that doesn't surprise me, but being from Latin America and understanding Merton's own particular appreciation of Latin American culture and spirituality. Merton was fluent in Spanish and could also translate from the Portuguese. So he was able to identify with that culture. I think that there wasn't probably a priest in the world at the time that Francis was ordained who hadn't read The Seven-Storey Mountain or wasn't familiar with Thomas Merton. So if you look deeper, you can see points of confluence and shared sympathy. Francis would have known of Merton. Merton, of course, would not have known of Francis. He dies in 1968, right? But it's an imbalanced relationship in that sense. But he was hugely influential in Bergoglio's spirituality. Bergoglio pays testimony to the power of Merton's witness in the US by acknowledging him as one of the four. You should know, by the way, that the American bishops or the committee particularly involved in oversight over the use of the catechism and curricular texts used in Catholic high schools had purged Merton. They thought that Merton was an embarrassment and a scandal. And so they took Merton out of the textbook. It's extraordinary, right? Francis comes along and he does what he does. So it's fairly reasonable to assume he's back in the textbook right now. Okay. So Francis tends to have a more prophetic, far-seeing understanding of the great Catholic figures, writers, visionaries, and martyrs.
The next three questions relate to documentation. So they're kind of quite technical in their focus, but we'll put three of them together. We'll do 1, 2, and 3. The first one is this: will Pope Francis ratify the reports of the committees working on the reserved questions? This is in the synodal process, as you know, in the same way that he did with the report of the synod itself. And the question is, if not, what will he do with them?
That's a good question. We do know that around the issue of ministry and women, particularly the diaconate, he listened first of all and read the report of an international commission. They established 2 commissions of his own. He's charged the current prefect of the congregation of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, Cardinal Fernandez, who is an Argentine theologian and a friend of the Pope, to undertake the task. It was called Group 5, to undertake the task of looking more deeply into the whole question of ministry and women. We do know that the final report made it very clear that the question is not dead. The question has not been shelved. It's open to discernment. The Pope says that. And by receiving the report in its entirety, he acknowledges that as well. It was a controverted part of the report, and although it had the majority of support of the Synod delegates, the greatest resistance to any of the recommendations or proposals going forward rested around that. And again, this is as much a cultural and political reality as it is a theological one, because the Synod had representatives from every jurisdiction in the world. So every continent was represented, many different perspectives brought to bear. So it's a complex melange of views and everything else. And so Francis has to negotiate that. There's no, I use the term because it was said to me at one point by a fairly prominent Canadian Catholic, is the Pope ragging the puck? Is he determined not to score a goal, but just to continue to finesse the puck, leaving the final decision to his successor? It's possible. I'm not quite so cynical. I think more likely he won't move without consensus. It's one of the reasons why I didn't act on the whole issue of what are called the viri probati, the mature married men, that many prelates and others wanted ordained in Latin America, particularly the Amazon, because of the Amazonia Synod. And he didn't act on that. And he didn't act on it because he didn't have the consensus he thought was important to move forward. You got to remember that, and this is not to defend Francis's dilatoriness on this matter, but it is to try to understand his perspective. He is Peter, and he's the principle of unity in the church. And he takes that charism very seriously. So if he's going to move, he has to move in the context of the universal church, not a commonwealth, not a group of churches, not the Northern Europeans or the Australians, but the whole church. That complicates matters. There's no question about that. But it also speaks to his role as Peter, and also to the very nature of the Catholic Church as a universal church.
Thank you, Michael. Can we go to the second question that relates to documentation? You mentioned that there was no apostolic exhortation after this past synod. The final, you mentioned that there was no apostolic exhortation after this past synod, since the final report already says it all. Did not the Pope say that from the beginning that this synod was not about reports or documents, that it was about helping the Church to learn and to listen to one another? Isn't this the most important raison d'etre of the synod?
In great measure, it is, because he isn't interested in just simply manufacturing more reports. That's quite true. He didn't want the delegates to be sitting around poring over a daily avalanche of documents from the different dicasteries. He didn't want them to be weighed down by reading various syntheses and trying to find some kind of immediate response. He wanted to encourage and to cultivate what the Parish, the freedom of speech, the freedom to speak, actually, and to do so in ways that are spontaneous, in ways that are faithful to the operations of the Spirit when it works within the context of meaningful dialogue. At the same time, of course, there need to be documents of some sort that are summary, that outline what has been accomplished. So if you look at the delegates as they gathered around the table, they weren't laboring over several different documents each day. They weren't. But in the end, they had to produce a document that would articulate the vision of synodality that they experienced on the ground and they're trying to share with the larger church. So yes, many documents, no. A document, yes.
Thank you, Michael. This is the third document-related question, and then we're going to go on to a set of different themes. I believe you said that Pope Francis did not add anything to the synodal summary reports in the past because he, quote, trusted the people who participated. I understand the importance of listening to each other, but trusting is something different. Are we meant to extend that kind of trust?
Well, trust, of course, is always a risky venture. You're quite right. But trust is essential for the church to move as a human organism forward if it's to achieve its own mission. Francis understands that the breakdown of trust in the church has affected his own ministry. Cardinals that don't trust him, bishops that have been public in accusing him of, if not of apostasy, certainly of drifting away from the organic tradition of the church. Try to think of anything comparable during your lifetime in terms of the other papacies. Inconceivable that bishops, particularly leaders, would be very public in their expression of disagreement and indeed sometimes visual attacks on the successor of Peter. It's remarkable, and yet claim to be a Catholic. Happens. It's a minority position, but it's aggressive, it's assertive, it's protective, and in the end, it's frightened. I saw some of the damage that happens when trust is shattered when I was in Rome. People are deeply suspicious of their interlocutors, like what is the subtext? What are you really doing? Are you crafting this in order to advance your own ideological position? And this is as much true of the progressives as it is of the traditionalists. Nobody has priority, if you like, or a privileged position with regard to purity of intention in these matters. We're all capable of being corrupted by, or indeed driven by, our own unique prejudices. I had one occasion, a remarkable young woman, well educated in the United States and in Europe, but in very traditional circles, not the kind of orbit that I'm accustomed to. And she would ask a question at every session in 2023 and a good part in 2024 as well. And they always came from the same point of view, that the Synod is a departure from Orthodox thinking by the very fact that it questions revelation by looking at different anthropological perspectives. Okay, number one. Number two, is it really a synod at all? Because the synod as reconstituted is an episcopal synod. And here we have about 70 people among the 365 delegates who are in fact not bishops at all. And in fact, a good percentage of them are women. So how can this be an authentic expression of an Episcopal Synod when it is not really exclusively Episcopal? So there was that debate and all these questions surfacing. She always asked with the same tenacity and respect, if not a little overly deferential, but with respect, but at the same time, unpersuaded. So one day I saw her with some colleagues. I was with some colleagues, rather. I saw her alone having some gelato or ice cream in the Borgo. And I thought she looked so lonely. So I went over to her and I said to her what I believe to be true, that the questions she asked were considered well articulated and forceful. And she smiled and she said, "Oh, so you agree with me?" And I said, "No, not on any point do I agree with you." And she said, "Well, I should punch you in the nose, but I won't because of your Irish charm." I didn't tell her I'm not Irish, but anyway, the point was you have to take every now and then a little risk in talking to people ordinarily you wouldn't talk to in order to begin that element of human trust. Look, in the end, we're baptized Catholics. In the end, we're in the same tent. All right. So that's the bottom line. That's what Francis is trying to say. I mean, it's a bit simplistic, I know, and it's more complicated in being realized. But if we're going to, as a church, recover something of the energy and power of the Holy Spirit in our lives, then we have to be open to that. And in being open to that, we also have to, going back to a point that I had earlier with Kevin, about being humble. I was saying, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe I got this wrong. I was talking as well to someone, a young woman from Belgium, and she was active in a movement called Deacons Now. I hadn't heard of it before, but it was pretty powerful in Rome. And I didn't really share her position at one point, but by listening to her, like genuinely listening, not marshaling my counter arguments, not thinking, okay, here's a weakness or a flaw in the position she's taken, I'm going to move in on that. Actually, just listening to her. By the end of the conversation, she had persuaded me. And I think that that's what Francis, I was not on the Synod delegate table. She wasn't a Synod delegate. It was a conversation in the Piazza di San Pietro, just by chance. And what you realize that when you create a culture of respect and trust, it will allow things to flourish. Now, here, I'll end this comment with this, because I think it's very important to say. As I said, I've been at several previous synods. Ordinary synods, extraordinary synods, special synods. There are three categories of synod. And one of the things you notice almost from the outset is that the bishop delegates who went to these synods were never publicly cynical, but they were privately cynical, because they knew everything had been decided before they got there. They knew what Rome wanted, they knew what the Pope wanted, and very often they were convinced the Pope had already written what he was going to say even before they got there. Now, that seems like a caricature, kind of a liberal shibboleth or something. It's not true. At the first session, 2023, and the delegates at the first session were the same delegates as those in 2024. A couple of changes maybe to replacement, but the same delegates. And I mean this, at every session, we had a session every day that began at, it was supposed to begin at 1 and to go to 2:30, but it's Italy, so it began when it began and ended when it ended. But we would gather for this. Bishop after bishop, cardinal after cardinal would say, "I've never been to a synod like this." I can remember getting off the plane from Kinshasa, walking on the tarmac in Rome, knowing that the decisions of the synod were already made even before I got to the synod hall. And every one that came forward said the same thing. Okay? Francis changed that. He didn't write a document before he got there. There was no set template that they had to conform to. They didn't sit in tiered positions, popping up to give their what were called interventions. They sat at round tables, cleverly conceived to be representative of women and men from various jurisdictions. They were linguistic specific, but in no other way were they limited. That is a shockingly different way of doing synodal work. Okay, so in the old days, everybody knew what We have wonderful examples of Canadian bishops coming back, enormously frustrated in public about their experience in the Synod. Cardinal Carter on the Synod on the Family. Archbishop Chasson from Donat Chasson from Moncton, deeply disturbed by the things that were being said at the Synod on priests and whatnot. This didn't happen this time. No, the bishops didn't come back and give press conferences and say, oh my God, that was a bit of a farce. No. Why? Because they felt they were trusted and they were respected and they could speak honestly at the table. There is one example of where they speak honestly and they offend each other. One Eastern Rite bishop got up and took his bottle of water and left the table where Jim Martin, the American Jesuit, was sitting. So I'm not sitting near you, and went to another table. But at one point later in the Synod, you could see them talking to each other. Okay, now I don't imagine they're going to embrace, and I don't imagine they're going to share the same view on certain things, but they came to see each other as companions along the way.
You brought us to Canada with those two bishops. Let's stay in Canada. Let's bring Francis to Canada with his next question. How does the Pope's visit to Canada make his apology contribute to his being a true disruptor?
Well, that's a very good question because, of course, the Pope's trip to Canada, and Darrell, of course, can speak about this as well, was not without its controversies. We do know that the Vatican and some Canadian bishops wanted the Pope to come to Canada much earlier than he did. We do know there was resistance in certain quarters to his coming, anxiety around everything from litigation to the use of the term genocide to whatever. And it was considered an insensitive time. Actually, it was the contrary. It was a very important time. And his witness here was prophetic. And if you talk to non-Catholics who were covering the Pope's visit, they were profoundly impressed, as indeed were many in the Indigenous community. The Roman politics of this are a different matter. And we do know that there were debates around how well prepared he was, the use of language in particular, the celebration of the Eucharist in Edmonton in a Latinate as opposed to an Indigenous style, all kinds of things that were controversial. But there were also things that were fundamentally revolutionary. Here was a Pope coming to territory, sovereign territory, acknowledging mistakes of the past, seeking forgiveness, listening humbly. If you watched the body movement, and you watched how deeply he was moved when he received the traditional headdress, and the way he attended to the listening, reverencing the other, not interrupting them, minimizing. I mean, I've covered tourists before. There's a lot of papal talk. There wasn't a lot of papal talk here. There was a lot of listening. And that listening was a humbling experience for him. So I think, and I met with the new Canadian ambassador to the Vatican, Joyce Napier. You may know her. She was a longtime CTV correspondent. It's I think, a very good appointment. And she said one of the important things that Prime Minister Trudeau said to her, he said, you take on this job as Canada's ambassador to the Holy See. You work to build reconciliation between the Church and the Indigenous peoples and Canada. This is your charge. Work on the recovery of various objects that are in Vatican museums that should be returned. And Pope Francis has made this clear. I mean, he said, if we took it, if we stole it, we return it. That he said it. So, I mean, it's important to recognize, I think, that tour, that pilgrimage to Canada was a highlight in Indigenous Christian relations over the centuries, and put the Canadian government in an important position. I'm afraid to say I don't think it mustered the courage to do the kinds of things it needs to do, but now it's in disarray, so we'll see what happens next. But certainly Francis's trip, it was unlike other trips. It was not typical of other trips. It was clearly classified as a pilgrimage. And I think it was, in fact, prophetic. I think it'd be an important part of the papal legacy.
on page 226 of your book, Michael, you footnote a certain pastor named Darrell Winkler, who also happens to be in on this call. So I think now would be a good opportunity for him to respond to that question. If he would unmute himself, and he can do that. There he is.
I was very engaged in the papal visit. From the moment I heard that I couldn't believe that he was coming.
Yeah.
When it announced that the Pope is coming, I just was so moved. And he said from the get-go, I'm coming to do penance.
Yes.
This is a penitential visit. I'm coming to do penance for what the church has done to all of you. This is what my visit is about. But that's why I can never understand what took place in the planning of the liturgies.
I know.
There was nothing penitential. There was no culture.
No.
It was all in Latin. And I don't understand why the bishops got it so wrong.
Yeah.
I mean, the air of the liturgies was Opus Dei. It's as if the Opus Dei movement had organized the liturgies. There was no language, all of these things. There was no, in fact, I attended the gathering in Quebec City, and all the bishops crowded around and there were survivors that couldn't get into the church. And that was the point for Francis to come, was to encounter the survivors.
Yes.
And yet the bishops were all crowded around, and all you could see were mitres. You couldn't see from anywhere else anything but mitres. And I thought this was a sad symbolism of something going on. I don't know. I just believe that, but I agree that this was such an important event to happen in the Canadian church, that he came here. And we all know why he came. That's what's the important part. What the bishops did and how they handle it, that's less important than the fact he came here out of an authentic desire to do penance on behalf of the church. And he would have, as you said already, Michael, he would have come long ago.
Absolutely.
Had he been invited. But he doesn't. He respects, what do you call it? He wanted to be invited. He wasn't just going to muscle his way in.
That's right.
He wanted the invitation. I forget what the word I'm looking for is, but he is, it's not, he's trying to decentralize the way things are happening. And he wanted the bishops to invite him first, and they did. That's when he came. But it was a moving experience for me, the whole thing. So
yes, it was. And I think, it'll be a little while before the church historians get all the details on this, but I think it was botched by the bishops. They did invite him, you're right, but they could have invited him earlier. He sent very clear signals to that. We do have evidence of that. It was mishandled. And so the experience itself for many of the people, particularly the Indigenous leaders and those who attended ceremonies, was deeply moving, and it deeply moved him. There was a wonderful, visible reciprocity between his penitential posture and gesture with the people and the Indigenous leaders and their response to him. I haven't come across, even the sharpest critics of the federal government and of the Catholic Church, I haven't come across anyone who was deeply critical of him. I think they saw that this man in white who had made this journey was sincere and authentic, and he heard their pain, and he was humbled, and it was a penitential pilgrimage. You're absolutely right. It was a great opportunity for the Canadian leadership to exercise a little more prophetic role rather than a defensive role. But he broke through that. He broke through that for many of the people. And you know why you can also see that? You can see it with the groups that he met in Rome. You will remember that the Métis and the First Nations and others went over and met with him in Rome, and you saw them and talked to them in the piazza and whatnot. They were all deeply moved. They were deeply moved by his authenticity. They said, "This man's listening to us. Right? This isn't a political gesture. I need to do this because we're facing litigation." No. He listened to the people, and they responded in kind.
Okay, so I want to, there's a cluster of questions that I want to make sure we get to all of them. I just have to scoop that one up as I'm talking and add it to the list. There it is. So, Michael, you refer to the science of theology. How valid is it without including social or physical sciences, which seems to make it dogma and doctrine driven? I'll rephrase. I've fumbled that. You refer often to the science of theology. How valid is it without including social and physical sciences, which seem to make it dogma and doctrine driven?
There is a great deal of discussion going on in theological faculties throughout the United States and Canada because of the crisis in theology itself. And I mean by that, enrollment in theological schools is plummeting. Talking to the executive director of the Toronto School of Theology, they don't know what they're going to do. They have to find a way of making theology not just simply available to people, but, and I'm loath to use this term because it's often misused, but relevant. And my sense is that that is probably best achieved by going the route of interculturality. So that what do the arts say? Very often the people have deep religious experience through music, through the visual arts, through literature, through poetry. Their taste of the transcendent is very often communicated there. It's not communicated in theological dissertations. And I'm not being critical of theological dissertations, although I am not a professional theologian, I'm an English professor. I have sat as an external examiner and indeed as a director in doctorates in theology. So I'm not unacquainted with the methodology, nor indeed of the value. But I am as disturbed as the questioner by the fact that theology that talks only to itself, what Francis refers to as auto-referentiality. In other words, we just talk about ourselves. And so we're an empty tomb. There's no joy. There's no communication of the witness of the Gospels. Where's charisma when we're just talking to ourselves? So that's a legitimate question. Now, with regard to its interaction with the social sciences and indeed the physical sciences, certainly the Vatican takes very seriously the social sciences as a Pontifical Academy of the Social Sciences, actually headed by a nun with a doctorate in engineering from Cambridge University. The consultants that the Pope has in terms of sciences, everything from AI to more traditional evolutionary topics and whatnot, that the Vatican consulta or group that works in the physical sciences is one of the most impressive scientific bodies in the world. Pope has ready access to this. So it's how we do theology in the church and in the parish and in the community needs to draw on these resources. You're quite right. Theology should be an integrating science, an integrating discipline, and not a hived off, archaic subject in which you engage in the pursuit of knowledge, but it has no immediate practical implications in the larger life of the church.
Well, the next question is, you are obviously an admirer of Pope Francis and his papacy. Do you see any weaknesses or failures on his part?
I think sometimes Francis trusts to his own judgment to an excessive degree. Let me be precise. One of the difficulties you see is Francis's working on the larger political landscape, establishing modus vivendi or modi vivendi with regimes that the church has traditionally been uncomfortable with. For instance, the relationship that the Vatican has with Beijing has been a source of considerable controversy. Cardinal Zen, who was imprisoned by the communists, is outraged by Francis's openness to Beijing. Similarly, the last governor of Hong Kong, Christopher Patten, former chancellor of Oxford University, and a very committed Roman Catholic, by the way. He has respectfully disagreed with Francis on this. He says, you're negotiating with the devil and it won't work. Francis is adamant that the only way of moving forward with Beijing, with China, and the recognition of the underground church is to make sure that the bishops are co-approved by both the government and by the Vatican. It's a way of providing continuity and leadership. This is major political coup, but the cost may be too great. Similarly, debates with the Greek Catholic Church, with the Ukrainian Church about the proper approach to Putin, the disputes around Gaza, Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Pope's continued connection with this family in Gaza, and the church, I believe, a marvelous example, again, of his pastoral wisdom, puts him sometimes in the middle of battle scenes, which might be better avoided in a more discretionary way, but maybe not. Maybe not. That might just be my more cautious judgment in the matter. Maybe not. But I think what Francis has to do, and these are, I think, are two weaknesses, and then I'll end this response. And that is, Francis has talked about the importance of having the right bishops. When he gave his address to those training to be nuncios at the Pontifical Ecclesiastical Academy in Rome, he made it clear, and he has made it clear again and again, the bishops he wants must have the smell of the sheep. Unfortunately, there are numerous examples where bishops are being appointed who do not have the smell of the sheep. They're former rectors, they're former curio officials, they come up through the traditional channels. And so that need to actually strengthen, revivify, in fact, on my view, actually purify episcopal ranks is not being lived through in the way that Francis wants. That may be in part resistance from the dicastery of bishops, but he has a new prefect there who was a missionary an Augustinian general and a missionary in Latin America, and has a lot of Francis's trust. So hopefully that will begin to change. You should know that one of the things that came forward from the first session of the synod, and in the second session it was polished or fine-tuned, was performance reviews. Bishops shouldn't be subject to impunity. They should be subject to review. They changed that to evaluations, not performance review, but the intention's the same. Like bishops should be held accountable to the people they serve. The other issue is clericalism. Francis has, and he did, there were in the 2023, he made 3 or 4 interventions. At least 3 of them were broad attacks on clericalism, the corruption that enters into the life of the church through clericalism. And he was particularly hard on seminary rectors who weren't doing their job properly and creating a culture of service rather than a culture of privilege. But again, he hasn't followed through some of this. He's been tinkering with it. I think he needs to do a radical rethinking of priestly formation in the 21st century. And he's too cautious on this. And I think that is a weakness because he's articulated this new vision more than any pope. He's addressed the potential for corruption in clericalism, and indeed its corruption. He's called it out for what it is. He's berated cardinals and bishops for allowing it to flourish. He's identified the problem, but he's not following through with the answer to the degree I would like to see. So that would be, yes, I am an admirer of Pope Francis. I think he's the most important pope since John the 23rd, Roncalli, in many respects. And but I'm not uncritical. I'm not an apologist. I don't think everything Francis does is right on, and I think he would welcome that. We've not met. A copy of my book was given to him by Cardinal Czerny, with whom you would be familiar when in Rome, but I've not met the Pope personally.
Michael, when I was reading your book, I thought you were about to quote Leonard Cohen. You don't. You quote a German romantic poet, and you use it because Pope Francis has used it as an analogy. Where the darkness is, it's the light that gets through.
That's right.
The original quote is, "Where the danger is, also grows the saving power. There's always a way out. That's where the door opens." Can you say very briefly, because there's one more question, which is more of a comment, but can you address that, and then we'll end with one more question?
Yeah, I think it very much echoes Cohen, of course, and indeed Leonard Bernstein in Requiem, in his famous Requiem Mass. And Francis is not frightened of collision. He often talks about his adversaries, but his adversaries are not his enemies. I think that's the point that he wants to underscore. And in this, of course, although he doesn't say this, and there's no evidence that he was familiar with it, reflects the thinking of John Henry Cardinal Newman. Newman often talks about truth being advanced by the collision of Catholic intellect. When you have ideas in formation and in conflict, generative, not stale or repetitive, but exciting, you have risk. You have risk. There's always danger. He talked at one point, did he not, when he was addressing the youth? I don't know if it was Lisbon or earlier, but he has repeated it, make a mess. But he doesn't mean make a mess in the Trumpian sense of the term. What he means is make a mess by taking risks, trying different things, experimenting, trusting, the kinds of things that you would want to see formative in our youth and in younger generations. So that's part of Francis's temperament, to take risks. The other part is to be cautious. Okay, so again, this tension. I'm the Pope, I'm concerned with unity. At the same time, I have to respect diversity. I have to take risks, but at the same time, I need to be cautious. So he's constantly doing this careful choreography.
Thank you, Michael. We're going to end the question period there because we're rolling right to the end of our time. So Thank you very much for such thoughtful responses to those questions. And I thank all the questioners, because we actually got through, with the exception of the final one, which is more of a comment, we actually got through all of them, which was great. Father Darrell Winkler, over to you.
Thank you. I've been asked to thank you, Dr. Higgins, for your presentation. Honestly, it was such a fascinating listening to you and the questions and the discussion. It's been a great way to spend a Sunday afternoon in the winter season. And I just want to thank you for your insights. I just have three things. The first is, I'm glad to hear it said again that the Pope is not perfect, that he makes mistakes, because that's encouraging to a pastor who makes many mistakes. And I know that, so that he can acknowledge, I'm not the, everything. Because I think in the past, our popes have tried to pretend that they're perfect in everything that they do. So another thing is you brought about his humility. We saw this from the very start of his pontificate, wanting to pay for his hotel room at Santa Martha. And then he advised pastors, and early on in his pontificate, not to drive fancy cars. Don't cause scandal by driving fancy cars. Your vestments, don't make them outlandishly over opulent. Wear simple vestments. So all of these things, as you mentioned, really talk about his desire for humility. He was a disruptor from the beginning. With this, remember when he said, "Who am I to judge?" That was already a sense of disruption. With what had been gone on before. He was already challenging things with his own thoughts, how he was. The idea that he goes from a magisterial approach to a synodal approach is a great insight and a great thing about the way he operates in his pontificate. It's been very comforting and encouraging. And then finally, I want to say that we will never have a synod again in the church held at the Vatican in the old way.
That's right.
But now it's going to create, and as you mentioned, this has been so his whole pontificate has been one of great paradigm shifts, and ones that the church needed. His papacy has been providential. God is the one God's Holy Spirit did that. So on behalf of everyone who attended this afternoon, I would like to extend our heartfelt thanks and for your insightful and engaging presentation this afternoon. Your expertise and thoughtful reflections have truly made an impact on me and others here today. For this reason, we have my niece, my mother was Indigenous, and all of us have been trying to relearn our culture, and she might have a niece who beads. This is one of her ways to relearn her culture. She makes objects. And so I've asked her to make something for you as a thanks. And this is, I don't know if you can see it.
Yes, I can. That's lovely.
This is a lapel pin that you can wear. And the symbol is a bear paw. And why bears are so sacred to Ojibwe people, because they spend so much of the year in hibernation, in deep reflection, trying to learn insights. and they're considered a very spiritual creature. It is said by the Ojibwe, that's how we have learned spirituality, is from bears. So this is represents your own time of reflection, writing, sharing your insights. That's what this represents, is your gift to our church, of sharing your reflections and helping us to understand and get a better perspective on how things are going. So that's what I'd like to say. And we're so thankful again for you taking your time to be with us today.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you.
Okay.
So this was recorded, and I just want to say one last thing. Please stay tuned to information, because we're having other speakers in the coming year and soon. Moira McQueen from St. Mike's, University of St. Michael's College, will be speaking to us. She's an ethicist and will be talking about medical care. We also will be having Nigan Sinclair. He's the son of Murray's recently died. Nigan is going to be speaking to us too in March, towards the end of March. And we have other fantastic things planned. So stay tuned. We'll be trying to make publicity around those things in the coming weeks. Thank you very much. And God bless everybody.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Kevin.